Welcome to YKJ Japan, and I'm at our mud pond in Hiroshima Prefecture. This year's fish are in. There are up to a faster start with feeding this year compared to last year. Last year for me I started rather softly with the approach and increase in feeding because it was all quite new to me and I was worried about pushing things too hard, but this year I've started a little bit faster and heavier with it. Of course, still during the coming weeks the feeding will be increased, but the initial start this time around is better. So there's 150 fish in here, and I'm hoping this year for some extremely good results. 125 fish are actually our YKJ Japan event fish. The others are basically fish outside of that event. There's 4 karashis and there's a handful of other fish, more expensive fish. And also there's a few in there and also there's a few fish in there that are unsexed, smaller toci. So those ones aren't included in the event because we can't guarantee those fish as being male. Sorry. So there's some smaller toci in there as well, mixed in with these, but those ones are unsexed, so those ones aren't included in this year's challenge for obvious reasons. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting year, I think. I think some of you as viewers will notice one key difference this year compared with last year, and that is the absence of lilies. So if you look over towards the middle section there, from the middle across all the way to the other side, covering I guess a total of about a quarter or maybe less than a quarter of the surface of the mud pond, there was a lot of lilies last year. This year, however, I've medicated earlier in spring to kill off the lilies, and not the whole area. This area that you can see now is unmedicated because last year there wasn't much in this area anyway. It was mainly across the other side. And so use some product which is actually used for disinfecting, or not disinfecting, for killing weeds in rice fields, to stop the weeds from growing so much in rice fields. So we use that product so it's food safe, as it were, and seems to have worked well because this year, as I say, the other side is much clearer. Watercolour's looking fantastic. Last year it looked really good anyway. One thing now, and I've kind of learned a lot from last year with this mud pond event, understanding the colour of the water, behaviour of the fish and so on. I mean, a lot of it's obvious, but some of it's less obvious. Like, for example, when you put the fish in, the water's cleaner. When you start feeding the fish, the water gets dirtier. But when you don't feed the fish, the colour of the water is different, because when you don't feed them enough, the fish actually start to forage around more on the bottom of the mud pond. So that stirs up more of the dirt, or more of the effectively decomposed fish waste from over the years, kind of like sinking mud. So that grey mud gets stirred up more if the fish aren't eating enough. So you can learn or glean, let's say, quite a lot of information really from looking at the water. So looking at it so far, the feeder on this pond is putting out about 50 seconds, I think, per feed. First feed is 6 AM, and then subsequent feeds are 9 o'clock in the morning, midday, 3 PM, 6 PM. And yeah, so we're at 50 seconds per feed at the moment. Last year we started at about oh, I think it was about 25 seconds, very, very low. But despite having a 50-second feed, with last year, the maximum we fed was, I think, a minute and 25 seconds, something like that, each day. This year, we're already at 50 seconds, and yet still you can see the fish are actually digging a lot in the bottom of the pond, so they're discolouring the water. And also this year they're hanging around the feeding area a lot more so far. So clearly the fish are hungry for a lot more food than what they're getting. So I will react subsequently to increase that feeding and keep it in keeping with what they're looking for. But of course, it's still early days, we're still in rainy season. Today's quite a nice day, but literally every day either side of today, and one or two other days these last few weeks has been really, really rainy. Rainy season will continue, I think another 2 weeks or so, something like that, and then it will start to clear, and then the true Japanese summer will resume. So it's really going to be August, September and first half of October that really most of the feeding and growth takes place. At the moment it's still quite a generous amount of food that we're putting in, but it will increase. With this number of fish, I would say it's going to be maybe 1 minute 30, 1 minute 40, something like that, during the height of summer. So we shall see. Certainly interesting stuff for me. Beautiful scenery, and aside from the obvious bullfrogs, which apparently were imported from America many, many years ago, apart from the bullfrogs, it's very peaceful and quiet here. The bullfrogs apparently were introduced back in wartime to Japan as a source of food, believe it or not. And it begs me the question that with the long-standing joke back in England about do frogs taste like chicken, makes me wonder whether it's got something to do with wartime and frogs coming, or frogs being used as a food source. Who knows? Something, I guess, to do my homework on. Now there's quite a big range of size on these fish. The smallest in the event is about, I think, 31 cm, something like that, which is slightly bigger than last year's smallest. The biggest fish this year is 45. Now what's important is to not be too put off by size, and the key thing really with this event is to try and judge the fish for what they are, for the qualities that you can see and identify with, body structure and so on. Of course, with the smaller fish it makes it a little bit harder, but a lot of these smaller fish are very late bred, and as a consequence it's really a lot harder to understand those fish. But a lot of these late bred fish will pick up an awful lot of growth, and some of the bigger fish won't actually put on so many centimetres in the mud pond. So it's kind of misleading to actually look at the fish for the size that they are now. So I would still expect even the smaller fish from this mud pond to hit, should be over 50 cm as an ESI, and the biggest fish I think will end up about 60 cm. So really small fish, you're going to see them I think putting on 20, maybe 25 cm of growth by autumn. Big fish, or the biggest should I say, you'll look at maybe 15 centimetres of growth, something like that. Hopefully more, but I think that's kind of being realistic. So what I'm saying is that size disparity, the size disparity between these fish, you'll see that gap close come autumn time. So as you can see, over to the left side of the image here, is the feeding hoop, as it were. So we've got a 2 metre by 2 metre square over there, and that basically is to prevent the food from going too far astray, because if it's breezy, even without the breeze, the food is going to drift if it's on the surface for any length of time. But with the, I'm trying to find it now, there it is. Yeah, so there is our feeding hoop, as it were. Without that, the food will basically drift in towards a bank and maybe get trapped underneath leaves and things like that. The fish won't find it, and then it'll just end up decaying. So we put that hoop in there, which is 2 metres square, and that is floating, and basically all the food that gets put into the Mudpond from the feeding machine gets retained by that hoop until the fish have finished it, because the feeding times on these Mudponds is quite long usually. Up to, it can take sort of 15, maybe up to 20 minutes for the fish to finish all of the food. What we actually do with this Mudpond is we are mixing floating and sinking food, and what you'll generally find is when the feeder first goes off, the fish are nowhere to be seen, because they will go down and eat all of the sinking food first, or predominantly so. And it takes a few minutes for the fish to then come up for the food on the surface, and from that it's easy to gauge the fish's feeding behaviour based on kind of how long it's taken them to finish the food on the bottom before they come to the top. Because what you really want is, if you push a pond too hard, you will end up with food going to the bottom of the pond uneaten, and then you end up with a decaying, like, food mountain, really, for want of a better word, and that will decay on the bottom of the pond, smell terrible, and then basically the whole rest of the summer is more or less out the window. There's some argument that maybe if there's turtles in the pond, turtles will eat the food, so it's not really such a big issue. But I've seen it before with mud ponds where the feeding has been a little bit overstepped, and if so, or if maybe the water conditions no good and the fish don't feed because of that, the consequence will be then that food mountain underneath the feeding area that then puts the fish off their appetite from eating food until basically harvest time in many cases. So in this case, I think it's quite important to see the fish's behaviour both before feeding and after feeding. So if you're feeding too heavily, then maybe the fish will be a combination of too slow feeding and also too late coming to the surface or coming for the food. If you're too light on the feeding, what you'll find is the fish are gathering around the feeding area really early. Let's say perhaps 15 minutes before the feeder goes off, they're already waiting for the food at the feeding area. And also once the feeding's finished, if it's gone within a few minutes, then basically that's your indication the feeding's too light. That will most likely be accompanied by the water quality, or not water quality, the colour of the water, reflecting the actual substrate at the bottom of the pond. So if the water is discoloured because of that, it's because the fish are foraging around because there's basically not enough food going in. So there's an awful lot of information or feedback that the mud pond will actually give you. So in a concrete pond, it's quite easy. It's easy to see how your fish are doing, easy to see how they're growing, feeding, and general condition. With a mud pond, you're kind of looking for different signs to tell you how things are going. Of course, fish condition is fish condition, but when the water is quite discoloured, it can make it harder to see the condition of the fish, because you do need to see like breathing rate, that kind of thing, and general skin condition. That is important, but it can be harder to see. But you've got other signs within the mud pond environment that will give you other indications to how things are going. So for me, it is rather interesting. Now in summer, this pond, it's about 4.5, 5 metres deep thereabouts, and because of its depth and because of its sheer size, this mud pond fortunately doesn't see too high a temperature in the height of summer. So last year this pond peaked out, I think it was about 26.5 or just over, something like that, the temperature. So that is very good, because quite often if you've got smaller ponds or shallower ponds, they can quite easily hit 30 degrees or maybe even slightly over. And when that happens, basically the fish go heavily off their appetite, and you'll end up then with fish growing metabolically longer but losing weight. Colour condition also suffers a little bit. So when it gets too warm, you've got to be really nervous about feeding, because the fish basically lose that appetite. They lose oxygen levels and energy levels because of it. This pond, given its size, it's really easy to maintain the temperature from going too high. Consequently, it's really easy to manage this pond and feed this pond ideally, if you like. So last year it was a particularly easy pond, I think, to run. Huge, but for me I think very easy to run because of those temperatures being quite predictable. At the moment, the temperature in this pond, I think, is in the 24 and a half, something like that. A good growing range, but like I say, in August time it's going to be a little bit higher, and but given that water depth, it will keep the temperature from going too high. Now, as with most ponds of this nature, they're actually used to feed and supply water to adjacent rice fields, farmers' rice fields. That's the general use of these. This pond is quite fortunate that there's an awful lot of fresh mountain water that comes into it, so it works really, really nicely. There's another pond above this one which we are planning to use from next year, and that pond is also good, but coincidentally there's one more pond further up, but that actually feeds rice fields that run down the opposite side of the mountain, or well, sort of 25% of the way around the mountain, feeding down that side. And that mud pond, actually the water level in summer runs very low, because that mud pond is actually feeding a lot of rice fields. So we're really fortunate that this pond and also the one above are supplying more than enough water than is necessary for the rice farmers that are using it. We're also very lucky that the gentleman that we paid to look after everything here and keep an eye on everything for us, and also do all of the grass cutting and so on, actually keeps koi himself, and that is a huge advantage because he's very, very vigilant. He also manages how much water the farmers actually get from this mud pond, so he controls all of that, who gets water, when they get it, how much they get. So he's very, very good at managing this pond for us, keeping the water level where it needs to be. There have been instances in the past that I know of where breeders have actually had mud ponds whereby farmers have actually pulled off and used too much water, and if the water level drops too much on the mud pond, it does have implications for the fish in terms of temperature and also water quality issues. So like I say, we're really lucky with this mud pond, blessed if you like, that we have the gentleman looking after it that we do. He also actually watches the fish condition and will give us a call if he thinks that there's anything that he thinks is not quite right, which is an added bonus. So for us, it's pretty much an ideal situation. Now if you look at the drone footage from now compared to last year, you can easily see that last year's footage, and I'll just insert a snippet of it, hopefully if I can find one. Last year's footage from the drone, you can see that there was an awful lot of lilies. But I went out last, I think it was March, April time, April I think, in the little inflatable boat, which I bought from Amazon, and basically put the weed killer substance out there. So that's kept the lilies at bay very well, I think, so I don't think we're going to have any trouble with that this year. Yeah,